Thank you so much for coming. It means such a lot. If you're down here, as Barbara is right now, she's looking up at a sea of friendly faces who are all here to see her. No pressure, Barbara. So welcome one and all. So Barbara's inaugural lecture this evening is entitled Briggs' Biography. I knew I'd get this wrong. It is a tongue twister. Thank you, Barbara.
Sorry.
Briggs' Biographies, Blue Plaques, Reflections on Feminist Architectural History. Now, when I first came across Barbara and her work, actually, it was a wonderful moment. She was giving a presentation in her role as Director of Research for the school. And she was talking about all the things that were being prepared for the last Research Excellence Framework. And she did it in such a thoughtful and meticulous way. And those two words have always stayed with me as I've known Barbara. One of the most thoughtful and meticulous people that I know. But actually, when we look beyond that, we look into the meaning of Barbara's work, what really sticks with me, and I know so many of you as well, lies in the area of her research and her research questions. In particular, she asks us to think about how seemingly everyday spaces and building types enable the formation of particular social and cultural identities and promote social inclusion, or not. And Barbara, the work that you've been doing most recently, a huge grant that you had a major research fellowship, which was a tremendous achievement. That's really part of the journey that you've been on. And I just love some of the titles of the work that you've done. You've worked on Bathroom, Newlyweds on Tour, a compendium of obsolete objects. How can you not be intrigued and fascinated by somebody who writes about these things? Barbara, more recently, you've contributed to the collective biography on Ella Briggs, which was published last year, and I know you're going to touch on that today, which is fabulous. It's no wonder that Barbara has won a variety of fellowships and awards. But for me, Barbara, when I think about your work, the feminist ideology, the feminist methodologies come through. It's your breadth and it's your inclusive nature, your intersectional research, your collaborative attitude, which comes across strongly in everything that you do. So please welcome for her inaugural lecture, Professor Barbara Penner.
Wow. Okay. I can't live up to this. But to start, thank you so much, Jackie. That was incredibly generous. And thank you all for being here. It's incredible for me to look out and see this cross-section of colleagues, students, family, friends, from all ages and all stages of my life, and you are all here in one room. So it's wonderful, and thank you for making time, and thank you for your support. I'm especially grateful because preparing tonight's talk has been an emotional roller coaster. This year marks my 31st year at the Bartlett. I came in 1995 to do the MSc History of Modern Architecture course, the HMA There are many graduates here tonight. And the course was directed by Adrian Fordy and taught by Ian Borden, and Jane Rendell popped up to do the occasional lecture as well. The HMA, now the MA Architectural History course, changed my life, laying the ground for a career and family in Britain, not something I had ever planned. I would have been astounded to know that 3 decades on, I'd be with Robin Wilson, who's here somewhere, steering the course into its 45th year with a teaching team that still includes Ian and Jane, as well as many other dear colleagues, Ben, Murray, Peg, Tanya, Mario, Ava, Edward, Nina, Azadeh, the Survey of London team, and many others. We must be one of the few places in the world to have such a deep, engaged, and supportive culture of architectural history, and I'm glad to be part of it every day. At the risk of getting even more sentimental, my case also bears out how transformative university can be, shaping friendships and interests for the rest of one's life. And these are all of those intangible things that don't get captured on costing exercises or spreadsheets. I've kept, oops, that's my cover slide, pardon me. So I have kept everything from my master's course, course outlines, photocopied readings, notes, and they sit in these binders on my office shelf. These binders are like markers or totems, and I revisit them every few years just to see how language, approaches, and methods have shifted. In that spirit, I'd like to revisit the topic that totally reoriented me as a scholar, feminism. And on screen, you can see the outline of that first fateful introductory seminar from '95, term 1. I should add that the handwriting you see here is that of my mother. My mother helped me track down these readings in Canada before I came to the UK. So, Mom, you, as always, are totally part of the journey. The potential of feminism electrified me and many of my fellow students, again, some of whom are here tonight. And we were especially inspired by 2 remarkable conferences. The first, Desiring Practices, held autumn '95, and Strangely Familiar, held January '96, and organized by a team that included Ian, Jane, and Alicia Pavaro, who also may be here. It's amazing to think that these two radical events were held within one 4-month period at the RIBA. And it truly felt like a pivot point in architectural studies in the UK. Nothing for me since has quite approached the excitement of this moment. But in the last 5 years, it does feel like there's a renewed surge of energy around architectural feminism once again. Since 2021, we've seen a rush of exhibitions celebrating women's contributions to architecture. And I particularly mention the Barbican's exhibit on Matrix, the cooperative feminist practice. These are substantial shows at major museums, so Maxi in Rome, or the Kunsthal in Rotterdam. And they're very popular. So the Danish Architecture Center's exhibition was its most visited show ever. 700 people came to the opening alone. These shows have been matched by a plethora of new publications. I'm showing just a small selection here, as well as dedicated websites with associated podcasts and sometimes films that disseminate research to a wide public. This surge suggests that architectural feminism has at last achieved its early ambition to go mainstream rather than just existing on the fringes. Yet many of today's projects follow a similar pattern and take a particular form. Most evoke women in their titles, and even though they engage new media and a far more diverse cast of characters, they rely on traditional genres: surveys, maps, monographs, encyclopedias, wiki editathons that seek to add to the biographical record. And biography itself is back in a big way. Again, this is just a small selection of some significant recent titles. And I myself have jumped in feet first, having written profiles on figures including the housing advocate, Catherine Bauer, home engineer, Lillian Gilbreth, and TV chef, Julia Child, shown here in her TV kitchen, defiantly wielding a sword. Tonight, I propose to reflect on this recent embrace of biography and think about what it means. I admit, even as I'm participating in this turn, it can still feel odd to me, as I suspect it does for others who came to feminism in the 90s. At that time, feminists were deeply wary of biography and of the centering of women in architecture. Before I consider the present moment, I'd like to go back briefly and remind us of why. When architectural feminists first entered the field in the 60s and 70s, their primary goal was to fight sexism and gain professional equality. Feminist historians played their part by uncovering stories of female space shapers, architects like Eileen Gray, or reformers and patrons like Henrietta Barnett. Disseminated through exhibitions, books, mainly biographies or including biographies, and the very occasional blue plaque, her story proved women could be architectural creators. Architecture, to borrow the title of this book, was a place for women. By the 1980s and 90s, however, the focus shifted. Influenced by post-structuralist theories and work in cultural studies, geography, and feminist art history, architecture scholars moved away from strictly professional concerns. Instead of focusing on the formal production of buildings, they explored the social production of space. This pivot is clear and strangely familiar, where contributors mostly focused on ordinary buildings, not iconic, from the perspective of use and experience. They asked, how do people produce space through everyday practices like Ian's beloved skateboarding? And how do daily spatial encounters shape identity? So an example, I had to mention bathrooms. Of course, it always comes back to bathrooms. But I think bathrooms are a great example of this shift. I first began studying bathrooms in my master's. It was my dissertation subject, and I've returned to them ever since in different ways. Bathrooms are anonymous spaces that enforce binary social categories through signs and design. Encounters with them seem mundane. Users face two doors, ladies or gents. But the reality of that encounter is complex. Entering one door over another may be an act of routine, of discipline, or of resistance. This photo of freedom rider Gwendolyn Jenkins about to desegregate a white women's restroom in the American South powerfully shows that far from natural, the social differences enshrined in bathrooms are culturally and historically significant, specific, and loaded. In these readings, identity categories, sex, race, class, are not treated as essential, that is, as biologically determined or fixed for all time. Rather, they're understood as social and spatial constructions. The key point for tonight's talk is that this shift from production to social production also reshaped the writing of architectural history. Scholars now rejected biography because it presented architecture too narrowly as the product of a small elite group of practitioners. Meanwhile, feminists worried biographies of female architects were reductive, tying their practice and work too closely back to their sex. To avoid taking woman as given, many now adopted the term gender instead. Gender emphasizes how sexual difference is organized socially in a way that goes past individuals. As scholars like Beatrice Colomina stress, architecture itself is gendered, not only by architects, but by the tacit rules and norms that reproduce patriarchal practices, from hiring protocols to architectural standards. And the way gender analysis gets at these tacit structures is one reason why Jane, Ian, and I preferred it for our reader gender space architecture, and why I've stayed with it in later projects as well. But the move from women to gender was not uncontroversial. It was subject to a lot of quite agonized internal debate in the 90s and noughties. Even as feminists, including me, saw its advantages, we worried the term gender was too abstract, too theorized, too removed from feminist political campaigns. It is because of the intensity of these earlier debates that it's surprising to see how quietly the phrase women in architecture has now returned and become prevalent. How do we explain its ubiquity? Does it represent a new confidence in feminist history? Or have we let our guard down and let essentialism back in? Tonight, I'd like to explore these questions through my work on this biography, Finding Ella Briggs, which was published late last year. And I wrote 2 chapters for this book. To lay my cards on the table now, I don't see what's happening today as simple regression. Rather, I'll try to show that beneath the surface, there are important differences with the way women and biography were approached, say, in the 60s, and how they're being approached now. This isn't to claim that our moment is somehow better or more progressive than before. Instead, I'll also draw out how it's connected to and enabled by groundwork laid in previous generations. So to start, Briggs was an Austrian Jewish artist, photographer, writer, and designer who practiced in Austria, Germany, Italy, England, and America. Though you probably can't take in all of these details, I've put up a chronology of her first 25 years, just so you get a sense of how many moves she made in that time. In 1918, age 38, she trained as an architect in Munich and was one of the first to be accredited in Austria. Her practice flourished. She was one of 2 women to receive a major commission in socialist democratic Red Vienna, the Pestalozzi-Hof, and she later would build a thriving practice in Berlin. With the rise of the Nazi Party, she was forced into exile, and in 1936, aged 56, that's a year older than I am now, she left for London, where she lived until her death. And this 4-decade period was my focus. Briggs was not Walter Gropius level famous, but she was a well-known and respected modernist. In fact, when she came to Britain, she was often referred to as the famous architect or the famous lady architect. Ironically, however, the very qualities that made her a good modernist, her mobility, and her ability to translate design developments across cultures, so she could inform European audiences of American developments and vice versa. These made her a very tough subject for a conventional biography. Her traces of her are dispersed across 5 countries and many cities and projects. And when we began, she had no dedicated archive. These are common obstacles for feminist historians who over decades have tested out different, often collaborative methods for finding them. For overcoming them. Finding Ella Briggs may present like a conventional biography, but it was collectively written by a transatlantic interdisciplinary team coordinated by architectural historian Despina Strategakos and Jewish studies scholar Alana Shapira. Each of the 16 team members had expertise in one of the different milieus that Briggs occupied. Moreover, team members all agreed to share research as we went. So we were pooling our research. And we submitted to a deep editorial process that sometimes overrode our own voices. It wasn't always easy to work in this chorus-like way. It's a good way to describe it. But these difficulties reveal how the sole authorship model, privileging originality, still defines much academic work. I'd also stress that while it had a singular subject, Briggs, the team did not take womanhood to be the sole defining aspect of her life. Without doubt, Briggs faced sex discrimination, but this was always intertwined with other factors, her religion, her age, as well as external factors of time and place. To account for the dynamics that were decisive at different points in her career, the team drew on intersectional approaches developed since the 90s. And I would suggest that digging into the full complexity of lived experience in this way is the opposite of essentialism, which returns identity to the single fixed point. Certainly, I couldn't have approached Briggs's UK years without considering such dynamics. Briggs had some advantages when she came. She was not unknown. For instance, the HA, the Architects Journal, published an article in 1936 on her work. She would receive support from influential architects, such as the founder of Tecton, Godfrey Samuel, and later Ernst Freud, whose family moved in the same bourgeois Viennese social circles as hers did. And finally, unlike many refugees, Briggs was fluent in English thanks to her time in New York. So it was very easy for her to work here. These advantages likely helped her to gain a work permit, no small task. And in 1937, she set up a practice at number 3 Gower Street, just down the road from where we are now. And I was tantalized to realize that right next door to Briggs, at number 5 Gower Street, was Bartlett graduate Gertrude Leverkus of Women's Pioneer Housing, which meant that 2 of Europe's best-known female housing architects briefly worked side by side. In 1940, Briggs registered with the Architects Registration Council, the ARC, and this is why the RIBA holds a file on her. And it is also why she shows up in Charlotte Benton's still authoritative account of exile architects in Britain, A Different World. And Briggs is the only woman out of over 60 architects named. But when this famous file arrived at my RIBA library desk, my heart sank. This single buff-colored folder with a few applications was so thin and so meager. It viscerally drove home how tenuous Briggs's British foothold was, despite advantages of class, language, and fame. Her life here was precarious. She was an older, single, divorced, female Jewish refugee, stateless, and briefly classified as an enemy alien at the start of the war. For almost a decade, she lived hand to mouth. In truth, we don't quite know how she survived. And she sometimes experienced real danger. Even though we work in Bloomsbury, we often forget how extensively Bloomsbury was bombed during the Blitz. And you will see that was Briggs's studio, and you'll see that buildings all around her were totally destroyed. And traces of that destruction remained in London for many years. This does not mean that Briggs lacked agency. Over and over, we see her skillfully leveraging her networks and her reputation to avoid erasure. But as she herself would later bitterly note, she was never able to rebuild her career to what it had been. And this precarity changed the story I was telling. Briggs's story wasn't an epic tale of an exile triumphing over adversity, as Laszlo Toth does in the film The Brutalist. And I saw this film as I was writing my Briggs chapters. Rather, her story was about resilience, about finding ways to survive and practice, not heroically, but persistently. In this regard, my big discovery was that between 1944 and 1955, Briggs wrote 30 articles on house building for Homes and Gardens magazine. At first glance, this may simply seem to confirm how female architects always ended up pigeonholed as domestic experts. But this reading is unhelpful because it assumes proper architectural knowledge can only be distributed through professional channels, certainly not through women's magazines. It misses the significance of these pieces. In them, Briggs systematically applied lessons learned in interwar Vienna and Berlin to the problems of post-war Britain. Her articles were rigorous and technical and demonstrated how modernist tools, extendable dwellings, as we see here, or prefabrication, or labor-saving devices could help deliver decent homes despite rationing and material and labor shortages. Her European experience also led to Briggs's major projects in the UK. So she received one major commission. And this is for the Stolon estate in Bilston in the West Midlands. This project has attracted new interest today because of its seemingly wild ambition to transplant the radical spirit of Red Vienna to the so-called Black Country. To this end, the town hired one of Red Vienna's guiding lights, Otto Neurath, economist and inventor of the isotype pictorial system. Appointed as Bilston's consultant for happiness, Neurath then brought in Briggs, billed as, quote, a Viennese architect of international repute. And it's interesting to see that in this context, her Viennese link is foregrounded. Bilston never fully realized its ambitions. Neurath died suddenly, budgets shrank, and promised communal facilities, nurseries, clubhouses were never built. But Briggs did build the estate itself, just over 80 dwellings around this long communal green. The plan's most notable feature was its mix of housing types, from single-family homes to 2- and 4-flat dwellings for single and older residents. As scholars have noted, this mix of housing types reflected Neurath's belief that community happiness required intergenerational bonding, or what we would now call inclusivity. But I would suggest that it also reflected Briggs's own experiences as an aging single exile. Briggs had strong views about how poorly British housing authorities treated people living outside of nuclear families, which she aired in Homes and Gardens. She stated, quote, "Single persons and childless couples are valuable members of society, and they deserve something better than having to pay extortionate rents for accommodation which will never be a real home." By contrast, Briggs's goal was to create real homes for all residents, paying close attention to interior comfort and convenience, materials, orientation, light, equipment. She was, again, to use a more contemporary term, she was user-centered and took seriously the needs and psychology of residents, especially women going about their daily chores. Take her account of why a kitchen window faced east. Briggs argued that if it did not, quote, "the rays of the afternoon sun combined with the heat originated by the preparation of dinner might destroy the calm of mind desirable for turning out a good meal." It's hard to imagine Walter Gropius prioritizing calm of mind for meal prep in this way. Yet, thanks to oral histories, we know Stolon's residents appreciated the care taken with such details. And Stolon today is no modern masterpiece, but it does remain a healthy, mixed neighborhood full of real homes, as Briggs promised. Stolon would be both the pinnacle of Briggs's career and her swan song. It led to her successful application for an RIBA licentiate and also for British citizenship, which she obtained in 1947. She continued to write for Homes and Gardens until the age of 75. In fact, her pace accelerated in her 70s, but no more big jobs came her way. She lived out her last years quietly in this semi-detached house in Enfield and passed away aged 97. and there was no obituary for this famous lady architect when she died. And this is the last known photo of her, aged 80. So, a few concluding thoughts. Tonight, I've argued that the return to women in architecture and biography is not mere regression. Instead, it reflects years of feminist challenges to conventional models of authorship and subjectivity. Today's works do not only recover the stories of exceptional women like Briggs, they also seek to construct new stories about architecture itself, highlighting different perspectives, practices, relationships, and values. As my colleague, Essie Esther, writes in her soon-to-be-released biography of exile Margareta Schutte-Lotzky, the other major female architect of Red Vienna, quote, Schutte-Lotzky's life is a prism to truly look at the history of 20th century architecture, culture, and its constructions, and through it, ask nagging questions about the politics of resources, labor, and memory, also gender norms, female agency, resistance, and even spatial forms of insurgency. In a similar way, my chapters have sought to weave Briggs's lived experiences and work in exile back into the larger fabric of British Reconstruction. The challenge remains, how do we embed these more fugitive stories and give them a lasting presence and effects? In this regard, it's important to note that archive making is a feature of most of the projects I've mentioned. As we carried out our Briggs research, our discoveries were deposited in a new Briggs archive at the Architecture Museum in Vienna, which now hosts hundreds of primary documents. Our book built an archive, and we're not alone in this sense. In the process of putting together the Barbican's Matrix show, researchers also created an archive with materials extracted from storage boxes, under beds, and in closets. This was the basis for this open access archive, Matrix Open, which describes itself, quote, not as an end in itself, but a jumping off point. And incidentally, many of our students today now use this archive in their research as well. In short, these new archives, as well as those from before, are planting seeds for future feminist work and practice, linking past, present, and future. Seeing the generative, almost palimpsestic nature of feminist preservation efforts has also softened my view on memorials. My 1990s 25-year-old self was deeply suspicious of blue plaque schemes. Like biographies, they seemed too crude in fixing women to one particular time and place. But Briggs's story changes what a blue plaque might mean. Instead of marking permanent attachments or grand achievements, it becomes a way of making or giving back space to women whose lives and legacies have been dispersed. With this admittedly rather romantic idea in mind, to conclude my research, I applied for a blue plaque for Briggs at number 3 Gower Street. The application is still being considered. The full process takes a year. On submission, however, I was warned that even if approved, Camden might opt for another address because Gower Street is already too full of blue plaques. I almost fell over when I heard this. I could hardly believe the irony of hearing there might literally be no room for Briggs on Gower Street. If English Heritage really wants to up its percentage of female dedicated plaques, it's currently at about 15%. It clearly needs to rethink some of these positions. And what is too much anyways? I personally love to see Gower Street becoming ever more encrusted with blue plaques for women, for Briggs, and also for Gertrude Leverkus next door. For me, this would be a far truer reflection of the ongoing layered process of writing feminist histories and of reinscribing women in all their complexity back into the built world. And with this vision of a plaque-encrusted Gower Street, I'd like to end and turn over to Ian. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to address Barbara. I am Ian Borden. I'm one of Barbara's professorial colleagues here at the Bartlett, and I've been privileged to know Barbara ever since she first joined the Bartlett and UCL, as you said, in 1995, so just over 30 years ago. I'm really honoured to be able to say a few words as if, I suppose, an introduction to Barbara's inaugural this evening. To be a professor is a demanding thing. It requires the person to be a veritable expert in their subject, to be able to expound, to profess their subject in an erudite manner. However, I think it's fair to say that today's modern world, a professor has to be more than that. They have to operate, to perform in a number of different ways, as Barbara has done for us this evening. So what have we learned this evening? And what would we learn even more if we were to be able to look at the whole 30 years, 3 decades of Barbara's learned research and teaching? And in particular, I think there are 4 things which Barbara challenges us to think about. And I want to say just very, very briefly something about each of those 4 things. And these are subjects, meanings, methods, and audiences. So first, subject. Or we could say, what is architecture? Very often architecture is considered to be magnificent designs by eminent architects, explicit expositions by notable theorists, historians, and policymakers. And to be sure, Barbara incorporates all of this into her work, from discussing the work of Rem Koolhaas and OMA in graduate seminars, through to housing and planning experts like Eileen Gray, Catherine Bauer, Jane Jacobs, Lillian Gilbreth, and as of course we've heard this evening, Ella Briggs. But Professor Penna's work, I think, asks us to consider other much more everyday kinds of architecture, ranging from, and we've heard of some of these from Jackie, and in Barbara's work, I love this list, toilets, bathrooms, kitchens, sheds, hotels, bathrooms, bedrooms, obsolete design objects. Architecture, Professor Penna's work proposes, is all around us in every moment of our daily lives. Secondly, following on from this comes our second category, namely the meanings of architecture. Once architecture is released into the orbit of Professor Penna's work, in her study, we find that matters of gender, race, sexuality, bodily functions, pooing and peeing, domesticity, agency, transgression, all come to the fore, and often in unexpected formulations and intersections. When you read or listen to Barbara's work, you constantly oscillate from what is supposedly mundane, bodily functions, into much wider and significant areas of our daily existence. In this, I would say, Professor Penna connects and embeds architecture with what is truly important in our lives. And to quote one of your essay titles that you showed earlier, flush with inequality, for example. This is a pretty rare skill. Third, methods. How do we say things about architecture? The techniques and processes used by architectural historians are not scientific. Instead, they require a constant and iterative process of interrogation between the available evidence, interpretations, theorizations, self-awareness of methods, personal positioning, and reflection. And in Barbara's work, we see all of this at play. Sometimes it is in the nuanced recall of certain cultural theories, sometimes with recourse, as we've heard tonight, to detailed, really detailed original primary archival work. But also, and I know this is how Barbara also works, very often with site visits, with films, with popular cultural artifacts, or, again, as we've heard tonight, certain biographies and lives and people. Above all, as with the account of Ella Briggs, in Barbara's work, we get a sense of her own engagement with these materials and a reflective thinking mind that is constantly puzzling out what this subject is, what it might mean, and how to communicate it. Fourthly, lastly, audiences, or who do we talk to? Now, of course, for a professor, this means often talking to other academics at conferences, in lectures, in public talks, in learned journal articles, in editing learned journals, all of which has Barbara done, her monograph book studies. But the modern day professor must do much more than this. And in Barbara's work, we see a constant engagement with, to give but a few examples, local communities in South Africa, with design history that appeals beyond academic circles, with contributing features to Places magazine, constantly organising and arranging exhibitions, doing walking tours, book fairs, appearing at museums, galleries, on radio, on television, and of course that most up-to-date of all media, podcasts. One last thought on this. It is a rare and oh so very welcome characteristic of Professor Penna that she does this, I think as she showed tonight, not only then in this erudite, knowledgeable manner of what we might call a traditional professor, but also in the accessible, thoughtful, reflective, approachable manner of a modern professor. In short, Professor Penna is an absolute tour de force. Her work takes us to new places, makes us think about new things, and guides us with a wonderful conflation of information, challenge, and innovation. Barbara, welcome to the Professorial Club.